Okay, so let's look at the first slide. This really kind of sets the scene of kind of the end of the war, really. What do you think kind of students need to know, I suppose, from the kind of at the end of the war in 1918 into 1919?
From this,
I think.
from
Yeah,
this source.
kind of, I suppose, the shame, I suppose, isn't it? The sort of sense of
Yeah.
sudden collapse in a way.
Yes.
The idea once great, proud nation has now had this sort of, as he says, their disgraceful treaty kind of imposed upon them.
Yeah.
Conquer them.
And also the vengeance would only be possible through military conquest, I think, kind of comes through, doesn't it, as well? It's not just a case of trying to overturn a treaty or maybe have a new treaty in place. It's reconquering. It's this sense that only military prowess can win through.
That kind of, I suppose, a longer, in a sense, it has a longer sort of narrative, isn't it? And it coming through the kind of the war is sort of always there in a way in the background. So it's sort of the background noise, isn't it, of the 1920s in a sense, isn't it?
Yes.
The idea that it's sort of on hold, on pause, if you like.
It's only a temporary blip that there isn't a war.
And even more before that, I know that sometimes goes out of some of the remit for the student study, but kind of going to the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870, 71.
Yeah.
It's sort of continuous sort of tension, if you like, generational tension between two powers.
Yeah. And I wonder if part of the reason why there's that a sort of anger towards the Treaty of Versailles, that it's signed exactly where the Germans had inflicted their own humiliation on the French. At the end of the Franco-Prussian War,
and the creation of the German Empire, isn't it, at that point as well? It's sort of tit for tat, isn't it? Really, you've got going.
They feel that sense of injustice, even though they, you could argue, was sort of the first to inflict it. They feel somehow that an inferior nation has now done the same to them.
Once great nation, exactly. Which is kind of, is, I suppose, added to, isn't it, by Article 231 as well, the famous, war guilt clause, in that sense, in terms of, Germany having to accept full responsibility. It's something that the Nazis kind of come back to, not just them, obviously, but particularly as we sort of focus on in the 1920s, more the rise of the Nazis, come back to the sense of loss, and having to accept the complete. Well, it goes back to that, your previous point about the kind of a once great nation, if you like, now kind of been, now sort of downcast, if you like, amongst kind of in more minor nations.
Yes, it's interesting. I haven't necessarily seen this before, but this isn't just the Allied countries; it's the associated government. So it's kind of anyone in the world or everyone in the world has sort of turned on Germany and used it as a kind of a convenient scapegoat.
I know. I've seen the original treaty in the National Archives, and it's basically there's one. There's like Germany. They had it there once in the just in the exhibition, but basically it's just Germany on one side, this huge book, and on the other side is about 20 countries. Britain, France, obviously, America. It's like Brazil was there, if my memory serves me.
Right.
So because point of really kind of Germany isolated, kind of on its own.
Even though it's an interesting wording there.
And sort of on the end of the kind of coming here to sort of Kaiser's quote, in the sense of it's interesting in a way, because even though he sort of says this, he sort of disappears from the historical narrative almost at this time, doesn't he? Kind of, once the man kind of epitomized the great German Reich, and now he kind of has just sort of disappeared. Kind of, exit stage left, kind of in a way.
Yes, so and that immediate, not even immediate, because the war hasn't ended at this point, but that real desire to be depicting the German loss as an internal job, a stitch-up job. Our politicians, not our soldiers, not our army, not our military generals,
and certainly not the way I kind of led them and stuff. I mean, I don't know really how many German people knew about, the sort of shift, to Hindenburg and Ludendorff, essentially kind of having this kind of dual dictatorship by kind of 1917, 1918. So really, when he's saying this in September 1918, really, he's kind of like a bit of a lame duck, really, isn't he?
Yeah.
To Wilhelm.
But again, his wording is quite interesting. I mean, I'm not sure in this particular case what he's necessarily referring to the whole of the war, but this idea that it's ended differently to how he expected. I think this is a sort of reason why I think a lot of politicians at the time, but also some historians since, have sought to blame Germany and the Kaiser. There's this view that this was something that they planned, that they had intended to go to war. So it partially explains perhaps the Treaty of Versailles. I think that quote, but also the sense of injustice that goes with it.
And I suppose adding to the political vacuum at the time, Hindenburg kind of disappeared to a certain extent. Kaiser Wilhelm certainly disappears. We've got essentially kind of new government kind of leading the negotiations, really, in a sense at that time, haven't we?
Yeah.
And speaking of Hindenburg here, we've obviously got his kind of thoughts on what has gone on, and sort of we look here, sort of not again going back to your point about Wilhelm, not blaming the army in a sense. Again, it's sort of other forces within, or certainly not the armed forces of Germany who have actually brought about defeat. So it's kind of you kind of see the beginnings, I suppose, of the sort of the threads of kind of tension, if you like, through the kind of early part of the post-war period.
Yeah, and the threat of further change and revolution in Germany. I think it's sort of forgotten, isn't it, that it was Germany did go through a revolution in 1918, 1919.
And it's sort of
he refers to, doesn't he, the revolutionary comrades who have violated their duty.
And it's kind of, but it's sort of almost, it's sort of, like you said, it's almost like not remembered as such, though, in a sense.
Yeah.
It's sort of the chaos. It's sort of, I don't know, it's kind of downplayed, perhaps, or certainly not in the kind of public consciousness, perhaps. So many years later now for us than it perhaps was at the time. It's not, though. The Bolshevik Revolution obviously is different, but it's happening around the same sort of a couple of years before. That has a huge impact in a sense. But which I suppose goes back to maybe what we were talking about, the kind of the thread or the narrative of the kind of the war being still fought by certainly forces on the right, nationalists, the Freikorps, who were kind of seeing it in a moment. It's quite good to have the Norman Stone quote here talking about kind of stabbed in the back, looking for kind of scapegoats, it seems.
Soft-brained academics.
Yes.
Interesting phrase. I mean, that's definitely true, isn't it? That Germans, certainly the right wing in the 1920s, pride themselves on being not sort of sentimental, but being anti-rational. Rationality not being a German trait. It's something
nostalgic.
We often kind of in stereotypical ways depict the Germans as being very rational and very clear, but actually the Nazis and many other groups of 20s wanted to say that German history was about the environment, was about the blood and soil and all this sort of stuff. And actually this new Weimar government created out of the loss of war was something that was alien and foreign and academic and rational, whereas Germans weren't. It's nicely sort of summarised.
They sort of packaged them up as well, sort of bringing sort of Jews as well, and the left as well. This idea of academia kind of part of the problem, if you like, not kind of they said the kind of the blood and soil, of ordinary Germans in a sense. But again, we'll see later, although in terms of the Nazis in a sense resurrecting those. The idea of the kind of purity, the innocence of a kind of rural, kind of agrarian kind of Germany.
And also there's sort of and in some ways here there's that rural German culture is kind of being, I think Norman Stone's point is that it's in contrast to maybe the new sort of vibrant, garish American culture that was becoming dominant.
That's a good point.
And I think
especially
Hitler
jazz
saw himself as a bastion against that.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of the otherness, really. Otherness described previously in terms of like communism or the left. Otherness described in terms of like American, especially Black American culture with jazz, that's going to be coming over soon, you know, around this sort of time period. So again, it's like, it's almost like Germany's under attack, isn't it? Not just militarily now, but also kind of culturally, you know, as well. You know,
and that sentimentality, that love of the past. Sorry, go on.
No, it kind of comes, isn't it, into this, you know, this sort of quote here from Burley, in a sense, sentimentality, the kind of the sort of, I suppose, sort of grief, really, isn't it, in a sense. You know, the idea of what has been lost, and then obviously thinking about, we sort of talked about sort of nostalgia in a way, blocking out, you know, maybe making it seem the sort of pre-war Germany perhaps far better than it was, you know, in that sort of sense.
And martyrdom as well. It's grief for loss, but also a sense that somehow that loss is virtuous, and that somehow, you know, losing in the future itself could be virtuous. I think there's an element of that within Nazism as well, that they never, to an extent, some, you know, even Hitler himself maybe never fully expects to win. It's the process of losing and the valor in loss and the martyrdom, which is important.
Cleansing in a way, isn't it? Sort of,
exactly,
in a sense, kind of expunging the past, if you like, kind of, you know, through that. And it's kind of, I suppose, in that sense of, you know, loss, or maybe in a sense from Kerschel's quote here, in the sense of there isn't a feeling of loss from some, you know, because again, as he says here, no Allied troops are still on German soil at the armistice. So in a sense of, you know, which links back, I suppose, into that kind of stabbed in the back, that betrayal. Well, you know, if there are, you know, foreign troops on German soil, then, you know, have we really lost the war? You know.
Yeah. How much of an imposition is it all?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Kind of this, you know, photo, I think, kind of illustrates quite well, you know, again, say in a sense, the years of, you know, of struggle that many Germans had. Obviously, it's increasingly at the end of the war, you know, more and more resources were put towards, you know, the Navy and the Army, you know, to actually, you know, but, you know, troops coming in saw, you know, their families, you know, had actually suffered greatly from, you know, lack of food, but they, you know, in a sense, couldn't believe.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. You know.
Yeah.
So it's got, I suppose, links into that, just the Foch kind of quote here, in the sense of, you know, it's an armistice essentially. This idea of there isn't really kind of, you know, kind of closure in a sense.
It's interesting that there were a lot of people at the time. Maybe not so much in France, but I think in high-profile position in Britain, that appreciated that this was only a momentary lapse, that there would be another war. You know, and this diplomat here, and I think a few others like Keynes, were quite clear that this wasn't going to end any sort of problem. It was just going to postpone it and create an even more. Well,
many, it's not just, I mean, it's also, famously, obviously, Keynes, as you mentioned, John Maynard Keynes was famously very critical of the Versailles Treaty in terms of, you know, not being too, you know, sort of punitive on Germany, but also, you know, David Lloyd George as well had similar kind of thoughts. You know, this is idea a bit like Foch's, in a sense of it's just an art of prolonging, you know, or this sort of stasis, this sort of delay, if you like, postponement of war, in a sense, you know. And then, going back to sort of linking to sort of Burley quote here, in a sense, is you know, the fact, interesting enough, is why, which were before, kind of the struggle here internally between, you know, these forces of the left and the right within Germany at the time. But it's quite interesting, you know, that it's essentially, you know, there are kind of leftists, as you said, the Spartacists, for example, uprisings and stuff. It doesn't really take root, it seems, as much. And again, I suppose you've got the Freikorps, for example, coming in. Many of them are still armed as well, so they've got that, you know, ability to sense be these sort of, you know, kind of ad hoc kind of kind of proto kind of armies, essentially.
And without the support of the Soviet Union, there wasn't really much hope for well, maybe not much hope for revolution. I suppose, you know, the communists and the social democrats politically, or in terms of elections, could gain a fair amount of support, but certainly militarily or in terms of revolution were unlikely to succeed, which gives the Freikorps and nationalist groups more of a say, really, in the 20s.
And they'd also, you know, Freikorps, I think, you know, would probably get more support from the British and the French, you know, further down the line, as it were, than they would, you know, anyone who was seen to be publicly supporting the Bolsheviks. And again, you know, the kind of image at the time was very much Bolsheviks as kind of, kind of anarchist in a sense, or bringing, exporting revolution to kind of undo, so it just sort of generally feeds into the kind of social and political chaos, in Germany, and I suppose the wider Central Europe, in the sort of the sort of immediate post-war world,
Yeah.
Okay, and there was on there. So and quite good quote here from Helmut Heiber, in a sense, looking at kind of the troops, many of them coming back again, sort of no homes, no jobs, returning to nice sort of adjustment again, for many people to a kind of a new normal, in a sense.
Yeah. And they had no. I mean, I think that final sentence is particularly significant. The democracy in Germany, as we've sort of hinted at, was relatively new. Even though Germany, by European standards, was quite democratic before the war, the 1920s, this new system, proportional representation in particular, was seen as being quite anti-German, quite destabilising.
Yeah, un-German, isn't it? Yeah, not because again, Hitler certainly uses that latterly in the 20s to kind of say it's been imposed. It's not part of our kind of social fabric.
Yeah. And therefore, anyone associated with it is not legitimate and is a target.
And interesting enough, actually, if you into that, the Evans quote here is quite good, sort of showing a sense of, even the democracy itself, a lot of the time, like Ebert here, quite interesting here, using, 136 separate occasions, using the kind of the emergency powers, the decree, Article 48. So it's interesting enough, shows you the kind of, for various reasons, the kind of weakness of German democracy, at that sort of time.
And also, in a way, how I suppose the Nazis weren't, in all ways, dramatically creating problems or dramatically creating new issues within Germany. In some ways, they were just building on what was already going on in the 20s. And when they do come to power, their use of Article 48, I suppose you could say, is just building upon the precedent that was already there.
Yeah, no, exactly. And then you got that sort of rolling into the chaos here. We've got obviously the picture here of these sorts of pictures. Otto Dix, who's a famous artist, often represented them in terms of sort of the dislocation of German society at the time as well. So there's lots there. Again, it linking in, to the 1923, which we'll look at perhaps as a sort of separate piece as well. So I just want to stop recording it, but we'll look at kind of again the after what the 1923 kind of brings about. So let me just stop her there for a second.